Chapter 4 Out to the Sandwich Islands, back to the Barbary Coast. The weather grew steadily better and better. We felt as though we could never get enough of the warm sunshine flooding the deck. Soon the dampness, which had made our life miserable for the past month, left the cabin and the forecastle. The cook threw wide the galley door. Warm winds carried us northward over a gently rolling sea. My uncle started to teach me what he knew about the stars. The deck was pleasantly cool in the evening. We would go out toward the end of the second dog watch, about 8 o'clock, and stay until almost midnight. I learned to know Orion, the Pleiades, Rigel, the Southern Cross, and many others. But the stars that stirred my imagination most were those in Cepheus, king of Ethiopia. Sometimes the stars seemed infinitely distant and aloof, but as we came into lower latitudes, they became softly luminous and seemed near enough to touch the tips of the mast. Sometimes I could imagine they were enmeshed in the shrouds. Finally, we came to Lima, Peru, and dropped anchor. There was a big Peruvian warship in the harbor with some such name as the Kawasaki. My uncle was a good friend of her captain. The Peruvian was a tall, dark-skinned man, a Spanish type, a descendant of the Spanish adventurers who conquered the Incas and stole their gold. At his invitation, we went aboard his ship. I marveled at the guns and at the massive construction. A few days later, we made our departure and set sail for the Sandwich Islands. We sailed day after day over a sea so hot and glaring that it might have been molten metal. Twice we were becalmed, and the ship lay like a tired bird on the glassy water. Finally, one morning, we heard from aloft the welcome cry of "Land ahoy!" Then someone struck up the chanty so often sung when the ship makes landfall. Only one more day a-reefing, one more day. Oh, rock and roll me over, only one more day. In due time we dropped anchor at Honolulu and went ashore. Here my uncle knew King Kalakaua. He was a full-blooded king. His skin was dark brown, and he had very large brown eyes. He was fat and jovial, and everybody liked him. My uncle and the king had a great old bout on champagne. I was allowed to come along, but all they let me have were unfermented drinks. The three of us, together with the king's retinue, went from store to store and saloon to saloon all over the city of Honolulu. The king kept telling everybody who my uncle was and what a fine fellow he had turned out to be. The king carried a bottle with him as an extra precaution against the long, thirsty voyages between saloons. What a time we had wandering about arm in arm and singing the greatest songs. When we got tired, we lay right down in the middle of the road in the good old dirt. Then somebody would think of a place we had not visited. Up we would get, and off we would go, fully determined that while there were new worlds to conquer, we would not lay down our armor. We hated to leave Honolulu, but all good things must come to an end. King Kalakaua and his retinue came down to the docks to bid us goodbye. He looked so dejected that my uncle promised to visit him the very next time he was on the Pacific. They had a drink on that and parted happy. We almost doubled on our tracks and headed for the Bay of Banderas in Mexico. We had an uneventful trip. The sea was smooth enough, and there was a good breeze. My friend the boatswain, whose name was Washington, would have done anything in the world for me. He was short and black and very pleasant, although he was little taller than I. He had massive shoulders. He was as quick as a cat. There were men aboard the ship twice as big as he, and as strong as lions, but not one would have fought the boatswain. When any two of the crew got to quarreling, he would walk up to him and say, "Listen, black boys, better stop your dickering. That ain't no way for two shipmates to act. Make you fight it out. If you don't, stop your fooling. And the winner has to answer to the boatswain, Mr. Washington, who can lick the tar out o' any man aboard." That would quiet them down. Sometimes, when the men would get too boisterous in the forecastle, he would shout down with his gruff voice, "Ahoy, down there! Where's your manners? I ain't goin' to tolerate no ruction in the forecastle." Not all the men aboard were as even-tempered as the boatswain. They were, however, the most gentlemanly crew I have ever met. Despite the fact it was a mixed crew, there were seldom any hard feelings. There was not a lubber or a mope among them. They were the only crew in all my sea experience who addressed each other as Mr. There was not as much complaining about the food as one generally finds aboard ship. We bowled along day after day, at length reached the Bay of Banderas on the coast of Mexico. As our water was very low, we took on a fresh supply. We also did some trading with the Mexicans. After several days, my uncle gave the order to up anchor, and we made our departure bound for Santa Barbara, California. As we sailed northward, we were at times within sight of the shore, where we could see the surf bursting against the rocks, or sweeping far up onto the sandy beaches. At last we came to Santa Barbara. We had no sooner dropped anchor than we saw a coastwise side-wheel steamer filled with passengers come up to the wharf. The whole town flocked down to meet it. The women wore wonderfully colored dresses and bright mantillas. The men wore boots with high heels, bright silk handkerchiefs around their necks, leather belts studded with brass and silver, and high sombreros. The crowd floated down the hill, bright as petals from jungle flowers. We went ashore and saw the old Spanish mission. Everywhere there were Mexicans weaving blankets. We made our departure the next morning, as my uncle was anxious to reach San Francisco. Our journey was without mishap, and we sighted the Golden Gate late one afternoon, with the setting sun shining upon it. Somehow it seemed we were about to enter the opening in a high wall. It might have been the gate to heaven. The abutments were so massive and golden. I half expected it to shut with a sound like thunder, denying us entrance. We beat about for some time. When the pilot boat finally arrived, who should come aboard but my Uncle Solomon, who was the ship's agent at San Francisco. This was my first meeting with Uncle Solomon. Although I had heard so much about his exciting life on the sea, that I felt as though I knew him. He was white-haired but hearty. He still kept his sea legs. My uncles had not seen each other for several years. They shook hands quietly, these two brothers who had so much in common, yet so little to say. They had fought side by side in every part of the world, and weathered many storms together. They did not talk of their adventures now. They sat together at the break of the poop, looking out over the bay, as if silence were more expressive than any words could be. Finally, Uncle Solomon said, "We are getting too old for the sea." "Aye, we are. Been a couple of sea tramps, Silius. A couple of sailors as would cry at the sight of land. But those days are gone. They're gone, Solomon. And what will come of the Deans when we are dead, and not a skipper among them? I've been thinking of that these 10 years, Solomon, and I've thought it out. That's why I took this boy aboard. He'll make a sea captain, or I don't know men." I had been listening up to this time, but something about their words troubled me, and I moved away. It was as though I were suddenly burdened with a great responsibility. It seemed that all my seafaring ancestors were watching me from their graves, on the land and in the dark sea, trying to determine if their faith had been misplaced. My two uncles went ashore and got permanent anchorage from the port captain. We anchored far down the bay below Alameda. A few of the men were crazy to be ashore. Folly, in particular, could scarcely wait to see the Barbary Coast again, and some of the men had sweethearts in San Francisco. Sally Brown was a Creole lady. Way I roll and go. Sally Brown was a Creole lady. Spend my money on Sally Brown. I had heard so much about the Barbary Coast from the sailors that I wanted to see it for myself. I asked my uncle to take me ashore so that I might see it. He said it was no place for little boys. However, I finally had my way. The Barbary Coast at this time was about the toughest place on earth. When gold was discovered in California, all the pirates, hijackers, ex-slavers, and cutthroats in the world flocked to San Francisco. There were still a good many when I was there. Everywhere north of what is now Montgomery Avenue and Washington Street were low wooden buildings. There were dance halls, gambling places, and little gymnasiums for wrestlers and prize fighters. I remember there were painted women in all the dance halls. Every time a sailor or miner came in the door, one of them would take him by the arm. This was the last stand of the frontier. The miners from back in the mountains came down to throw away their gold. When I was there back in the 70s, they were still carrying gold dust in pouches and paying for their drinks with the dust. They wore high boots, red shirts, bandanas around their necks, and great felt hats. They were romantic-looking fellows in their picturesque garb. We went ashore to see the Barbary Coast, and ate at a French restaurant a few blocks from the district. We had a 7-course meal with wine. The food was excellent. We met Foley at one of the saloons. He was ugly drunk. Better go aboard ship, my uncle told me. Say, skipper, ain't this shore leave we're on? I'll not go aboard this night, so help me, Damned if I will. Have your own way, my uncle said, as we were walking away, but you'll be in trouble before the evening is over. You're in a tough crowd. These here lubbers, he shouted after us. I can lick 10 of them sober, and 20 when I'm drunk. We went back to the ship early, as the town was full of cutthroats and thieves. I must have slept about an hour when I heard a commotion on deck. I rolled out to see what was the matter. Foley had just been brought aboard, and lay unconscious on the deck. Half a dozen sailors were bending over him with a ship's lantern. His face was cut and his nose was split wide open. The blood ran everywhere. It was my first glance at a really brutal side of life. As I stood looking down at the beaten and cut body of Foley, I heard someone calling in a hoarse voice for the first mate, who was the ship's doctor. "Oh, Mr. Watson, Mr. Watson." Chapter 5. The Full Moon and Her Villainous Crew. We must have been anchored in San Francisco Bay 2 or 3 months. It gave us a chance to see the city, and to do a large amount of profitable trading. The population was both gallant and lawless, generous and criminal, brave and cowardly. No one feared losing his money, for he knew that any one of a dozen friends would stake him to food, clothing, and shelter. Enormous fortunes were made and lost over the gambling tables. The knights of the Western civilization were having their last fling. I saw my Uncle Solomon every day or two. Some days we wandered along the waterfront together. Often we would cross the bay and go on horseback up into the mountains or out to my uncle's ranch, which was within an easy ride of the city. He was a man of perhaps 5 feet 9 inches, a shade darker in color than I, yet very light for a full-blooded Negro. He was old and a little tired when I knew him, but he still retained something of the rugged and vigorous appearance he must have had as a younger man. As we walked or rode together, he told me how he had come to San Francisco. I've done about everything in the world, I guess, fishing, fighting, trading, and what not, sailing my boats all over the 7 seas. Just happened I was fishing off the banks of Newfoundland in 49, or was it 48? Ran my little schooner into Marblehead and went ashore. Everybody chattering like a bunch of blooming monkeys. Gold, they says. Gold in California. Gold so thick you can pick it up by the handful. Sold my little schooner for a song I did. Bought a barkentine like the traveler there, and took aboard as crazy a bunch of gold-mad maniacs as you ever set eyes on. We started out for California by way of the Horn. Hit some pretty rough weather that trip. Crew was bad, and the passengers were worse. Finally got out here, though. Then the crew deserted, and I had to sell the boat. Nothing for me to do but buy a pick and a pan and a shovel, and follow them up into the hills. I guess I've made my living most every way you can think of. Best of all is being a skipper aboard a good, smart boat. That's what you'd better be, sonny. It's the only life for a dean. We finally left for San Francisco and sailed northward to Eureka. I remember the redwood trees, 40 and 50 feet in diameter. The mate who had taken a great liking to me since my fortunate catch in the Gulf of Mexico, and who was no longer gruff or surly when I came back to fish with him off the taffrail, took me into one of the forests. Them trees are the oldest living things on the face of God's earth, he told me. They're even older than your uncle, and he ain't as young and sweet as he once was neither. We stopped at Astoria, at the mouth of the Columbia River. It was a fishing city, the inhabitants making their living off the heavy runs of salmon, which they took in nets and with hook and line. Most of the people were Indians and old friends of my uncle. One night the Indians took my uncle and me fishing for salmon. The first mate, who was next in command and therefore responsible for the ship in my uncle's absence, could not accompany us. He tried to hide his envy by declaring he'd not be bothered by such small fry, and he tried to prove that salmon ain't such a sporting fish anyhow. The fishing boats were large enough to hold several men. The Indians propelled the boats far out into the river and dropped anchor. We fished by the weird and wavering light of resinous torches. I caught several salmon weighing from 20 to 30 pounds. When we finally left the Indians and went aboard our ship, I found myself unable to sleep. My mind was filled with the smoky flames of the torches, the sharply silhouetted faces of the Indians, and the struggling of the great salmon. At Tacoma, in Puget Sound, they were just commencing to build a city. 300 or 400 feet from the point in the bay where we dropped anchor, they were driving in piling for a new dock. The only permanent people were the Indians. The others were a rough bunch of pioneers, hard at work defacing the scenery with frame houses. The city, such as it was, amazed the Indians, but to me it was a great disappointment. Tacoma had been a name to conjure with until I had seen it. We were here only a day or two, and one morning my uncle gave the order to up anchor. We were headed for Japan. We threaded our way out of Puget Sound, and in due time reached the broad Pacific. My uncle and the first mate were always talking about making the Great Circle, about the weather, and about the Gulf of Alaska. I asked my uncle innumerable questions. Some of his answers left me wondering. I finally understood, however, that when he was discussing the Great Circle, he was discussing the nearest route between 2 points on the globe, and that their desire was to make Yokohama, Japan, just as soon as possible. Their hope was to avoid the adverse currents and treacherous storms that arise in the Gulf of Alaska. We had been sailing but a few days when a wind sprang up from behind and commenced to blow strong and chill. The ship ran ahead like a frightened thing, like a hare pursued by hounds. We seemed to be racing with the waves and the clouds. Then, as if we were playing some enormous game, the wind shifted, then shifted again. It wished to encircle us and block our course with an airy, invisible wall. From each new quarter it descended upon us without mercy. We had hit rough, cold weather off Cape Horn, much colder than we were having now, but nowhere on the voyage did we encounter such high seas. It seemed as though the water, which had piled up ahead of the wind for hundreds of miles, directed all its energy into the crushing, slashing blows it dealt the ship. It was impossible to hold her to her course. Now the talk turned to the islands, the islands, the islands. Some spoke of them with fear, and some swore softly and watched the horizon with anxious eyes. My uncle and the mate studied the charts in the cabin and shook their heads. "What islands?" I asked. Neither of them noticed me. "What islands?" I insisted. The mate looked up. What's that?" "Oh, the Aleutian Islands, sonny, and many a good ship's gone down to Davy Jones' locker, driven against them rocky shores. We were running almost stripped, and yet we hurtled forward like wounded quarry. Sometimes a wave hitting us squarely on the quarter would send a shudder all through the boat. Once a sailor who with 2 others had gone aloft to reef a sail lost his foothold in a sudden gust, and hung dangling above the rushing sea. Then, with almost superhuman strength, he pulled himself back to safety. I began to see how small and helpless man is, and how great and how almighty the sea and the wind. My uncle hardly took the time to eat and sleep. He never had a moment to talk to me. One evening, however, after we had eaten, he did not hurry away to the deck, but sat with his head in his hands, as if he were trying to think his way through some difficult problem. At last he said, "Out here on the sea, where there's nothing but a board betwixt man and death, you get to thinking long, deep thoughts, Harry. Thoughts you'd never think on shore. Now, that fellow the other day, what was it an accident he slipped, and mere luck he said saved himself, or was it all mapped out like we pick a course on that chart there? I've been thinking a lot about the cause of things, and I think I figured it out. It's fate that does it. Maybe we'll get through this storm, maybe we won't, but we can't change things much either way." He went out on the darkening deck a few moments later, and I slipped into my oilskins and followed. I was all but swept off my feet by a gust of wind, and blinded by the salt spray. The wind was whistling and moaning through the shrouds. There was just enough light to see file on file of black seas, foaming at the crest, sweep against us, and then, under the force of a mad, whirling gust of wind, we were all but on our beam's end. From the companionway to the forecastle dark forms scurried. I heard their cries faint and far away. The ship staggered, hesitated, and righted herself, churning the water which had flooded the waist into a white, swirling mass of foam. I heard my uncle's voice in my ear. "This is no place for you, lad. Get back in the cabin." As I made my way back, I could hear his orders deep and clear over the uproar of the storm, and the crew's "Aye, aye, sir," as it scattered down the wind. That was the last I saw of the storm, relegated against my will to the comparative safety of the cabin. By morning, the wind had subsided, almost as miraculously as it had arisen. The sea was still rough, but in comparison with its former fury, it seemed as peaceful as an inland lake. A bleak sun shone upon us. It was the first time in days that we had seen its face. The weather continued chill but clear. Several days later, we crossed the international date line. We were all elated that we had weathered the storm, and that we were so well along on our journey. In due time we arrived at Yokohama, Japan, and from that day until the day we left, Hong Kong bound for the Cocos Islands. The trip was exotic, unreal, and dreamlike. The events and impressions are interwoven in my mind like the figures and designs in tapestry. There was an Oriental pilot to guide us through these waters. I remember junks on the China Sea. Yellow-skinned sailors, Hong Kong and its city of boats, the trip up the river to Canton. Temples on either shore, small flowering trees, petals on the dark water. Then I remember our new cargo at Canton, rice, tea, and gorgeous silks, medicinal herbs and roots, precious old jade, a set of earrings, rings, and bracelets of yellow gold, set with blue stones. All too soon we went back down the river. Folly was recovering slowly and came on deck for the first time as we were about to make our departure from Hong Kong for the Cocos Islands. He was convalescent and irritable. Sure, and we're in China, ain't we? That's a fine place to be, that is. Who'd be wanting to go ashore among these heathens? They ain't human, they ain't. Not long after we left Hong Kong, we were winding in and out among channels and straits, seldom out of sight of land. We went ashore on beautiful tropical islands, covered with palm trees and pepper trees, with bright-colored birds in the foliage. On some islands the vines and verdure came right down to the water's edge. On others there were narrow sand beaches. Sometimes when we lay at anchor we could look down through crystal water and see great sharks rolling lazily. The first mate was always harpooning them. If anyone asked him why, he'd say, "I'll fix it so a man dares wash himself hereabouts without losing a leg or an arm for his trouble." We could have rendered a lot of oil from these sharks if we had had the facilities. At one island where we stopped, a young beachcomber came aboard. He was perhaps 22 or 3 years of age. Under his ragged and torn clothes, his body was strong and brown. The mate and I had just noticed a big shark, not more than a dozen feet from the vessel. He was going to run for his harpoon when the beachcomber stepped up. "Gimme 50 cents. Get him with knife," he said. The mate gave him the coin. "Watch him, sonny. You'll see some fun." I did watch with both eyes, held by a terrible fascination. The beachcomber stripped, saw to his knife, and dove. Down, down he went through the crystal water, with even graceful strokes. Now he was almost under the shark. Now he had drawn his arm far back for the thrust. The shark, suddenly aroused, slipped forward with a flip of his tail. We could see the boy thrust the knife upward with all his strength into the abdomen of the onrushing shark. Then the sea was clouded with blood, and for a moment we saw nothing. That was a long moment. I felt sure that no man could be a match for a shark, there in the great fish's own element. But the next moment the boy was climbing to the deck, smiling broadly. "How can you do it?" I asked worshipfully. "Easy," he said. "Stick knife in belly. Shark swim. Cut hisself open. Easy." Our cargo was becoming more and more valuable at every port. My uncle was very anxious to get it to Europe. so we sailed more and dropped anchor less. From the Cocos Islands, we made only one stop, in India. That was Calcutta. When we made our departure from this port, we sailed right across the Indian Ocean for Aden, Arabia. By the time we reached the Indian Ocean, I had become quite proficient at shooting the sun and reading the vernier, but the moon, with its apparent caprices, was quite beyond my skill. Here at Aden we did our business with Cowage Dinshaw, a Parsee. It was to him that we traded cargo for several of the finest Persian rugs I have ever seen, closely knotted and of rich color and design. He showered presents upon us and took us to see the wonders of Aden. He wore a skull-cap and a long coat of yellow Indian silk. The most remarkable sight in Aden was the burial of the dead. The bodies are sacrificed to the buzzards, which are considered sacred birds by all who hold to the Parsee faith. The dead body is placed upon an iron grating over a hollow tower, the pit of which is filled with quicklime. As the funeral procession reaches the tower, the bones of the corpse are broken with mallets. As the ceremony ends and the mourners leave, the dark cloud of buzzards descend to their ghastly feast. As the bones are picked clean, they fall through the grating into the lime beneath. The religion surrounding this unlovely custom is mystical and impressive, and not at all unlovely. As my uncle tried to explain it to me, and as I learned in later years, the manner in which they dispose of the dead is an ingenious technique designed to save the spirit from physical transmutation. To these Parsees, fire, water, and earth are the three elements. If the body were consigned to any of these, since all three are tangible and physical, the transmutation would bring the spirit of the deceased to new life in mortal form. But if the flesh is consigned to none of these, as when it is eaten by the buzzards, the spirit goes to the Parsee, heaven, to life immortal. I was unable to understand the full significance of these burials, and I wanted to shoot the buzzards. This shocked the good Cowage Din Shah, and would have put me in real danger had I carried out my designs on the birds. I could not understand Cowage's angry words, but my uncle told me the Parsee was saying, "Ah, young infidel, wicked child possessed of 1,000 devils, ungrateful one, is this the manner in which you repay my kindness?" When we made our departure from Aden, we sailed across the straits of Bab el Mandeb to a port called Berbera, then on down the coast day after day. At Zanzibar we took on ivory and spices and gums, leopard skins, hides and coffee, aromatic herbs and henna. After several weeks at Zanzibar, we set sail for Lourenço Marques in the Portuguese colony. We met with unusually fine and dreamy weather in these waters. Every one was well. Foley had entirely recovered, but his face retained several ugly scars. I had always been interested in Africa because of the stories I had been told, and because it was the continent from which my ancestors had come. Now, for the first time, I was sailing along its shores, and my wonder and admiration grew daily. I was not satisfied with seeing its shores, however. I wanted to see its forests and jungles, its lakes and rivers. I wanted to see for myself the remnants and ruins of its glorious past. Most of my conceptions of Africa had come from my Arabian Chronicles. In this glamorous old document, the country had been called Libya, the heart and had extended to the Caspian and Black Seas, including all of Arabia. Modern geographers have separated Africa from Asia at the Red Sea and the Isthmus of Suez. I preferred to think of it as I had learned it when a child. As we sailed southward from the Lourenço Marquise, the weather became cooler daily. Occasionally there were squalls and rain, but for the most part the weather was clear, with favorable winds. Despite the bad reputation of the Cape of Storms, we had little trouble in this region, and dropped anchor in Table Bay at Cape Town without mishap. Here I saw for the first time the city which was to play such an important part in my life. And after perhaps a week of trading, my uncle gave the command to up anchor. Soon we were bowling along toward Sardanha Bay. So far my life had been carefree and unmotivated. I was merely living to live, in the true boyish way. I had determined in a vague way to follow the sea. No strong urge had arisen within me, however. I was floating aimlessly with the wind and the tide. But at Sardanha Bay there was an incident which brought about a sharp change in my life and started me on my quest. The natives at Sardanha Bay were the Hereros. My uncle was a good friend of the king of this tribe, and had, during his career as a sea captain, recruited several of the king's men and given them a nautical training aboard his ship. When we dropped anchor and came ashore, we were given a royal welcome, and for several days we stayed as the king's guests. Cattle, goats, and chickens were killed and roasted to celebrate our coming. We were offered a large hut in which to sleep and live, but we declined in favor of our own comfortable cabin aboard the ship. One evening my uncle and I were sitting on the rocks down near the beach. A full moon was riding in the sky, and by its light we could see our ship, where it lay at anchor in the bay. For some time we were silent. Then my uncle commenced to tell me this story. In the year 1619, a Dutch ship from the Cape, named the Full Moon, had come in Sardanha Bay to get water. At that time the king of the Hereros was an old man and an invalid. The Dutch captain had seen the situation, and having his own unscrupulous ends in mind, had devised a treacherous plan. To succeed, it had been necessary to incapacitate the king and his best men. The captain had offered his medical services to the king. He had told the king that he could make wine out of water, scare away devils, raise the dead, and 100 other equally miraculous things. That to cure a sick man was as easy as lifting his hand. The sick old king and his counselors had been overjoyed, and had allowed the Dutch captain and several of his men to come ashore. This had been exactly what the captain had wished. He had ordered the sailors to carry ashore a great quantity of Holland gin, which they had proceeded to pour down the throats of the unsuspecting natives, until every able-bodied man in the kraal had become dead drunk. Then, when they had placed all the warriors and the king In a stupor, they had robbed these natives of all their valuable possessions, kidnapped 16 little girls and 4 little boys, all under the age of puberty, and had made their departure. These defenseless children, after a terrible voyage in the hold of the vessel, had later been sold into slavery at Jamestown, Virginia. That's how it started, my uncle concluded. From then on, they were buying and selling men and women like so many dumb animals, the length and breadth of the colonies. I was incensed at the Dutch captain's wickedness. Why didn't they chase the Dutchmen and shoot them and bring back their little children? I asked. Not a ship among them, my uncle explained. That has been the downfall of our race. They shall have ships, they shall have ships, they shall. I said this over and over again as I sat on the beach in the moonlight. Chapter 6. Is this the hill? Is this the kirk? Is this mine own country? As we went northward toward St. Helena, the sailors discussed Napoleon Bonaparte. They considered the ethical, political, and military aspects of his career. They held widely divergent opinions as to the real greatness of the man. Foley at least credited Napoleon with discretion. You'll notice he didn't send no army into Ireland. I suppose he says to himself, what's the use of sending my men to sudden death and destruction like that? It'd only take a handful of micks to lick my whole army. There's no denying he was a smart man, and I remember the mate's solemn words on the subject that seemed too sagacious to question, and therefore closed the discussion. Who says I'm for the freedom of the seas? He asked. Napoleon. And who made 'em free? Napoleon Bonaparte. So I, for one, maintains he's the best friend a sailorman ever had. We dropped anchor at St. Helena and went ashore. We met a superior lot of colored people there. They talked English, with scarcely an accent, and for such an out-of-the-way part of the world, were very sophisticated. The climate was better than that of California. There was no real poverty. After several days of trading on the island, my uncle gave the order to up anchor, and we made our departure. We headed for Harper, Liberia. Two things filled my mind as we sailed northward. One was the story of the full moon, and the treacherous capture of the young natives. The other was Liberia, of which I had heard so much as a child. Slowly the two trains of thought merged into one. My desire to someday build a fleet for the Ethiopian race, and thus help them to free themselves from bondage, had found its immediate source in the story of the full moon. My knowledge that Liberia was the one bit of land in all Africa still held by its rightful heirs made me think of its importance as a base for operations. The dark continent held a new interest for me, and the troubles of my race had taken on a new significance. Even at that early age, I was dreaming of an Ethiopian empire. Our course now lay through the doldrums, a region circling the earth on either side of the equator. Luckily, we struck a period with good trade winds. At certain seasons of the year, A ship may be becalmed for weeks in these latitudes, and rest motionless on glassy water under a terrific sun. We sailed for many days through a tropical sea. Early one morning we sighted the mouth of the Kavala River, and shortly after dropped anchor in front of Harper, Liberia. My uncle was interested in starting an observatory at Harper to observe the southern heavens, and a research laboratory to study the peculiar magnetic and electrical phenomena he had always noticed in these regions. On this particular trip, however, we merely stopped to trade and to visit some of our relatives. These relatives, together with many friends, overwhelmed us with kindness and generosity when we went ashore. We were feasted and feted and given many presents. When we had been in Harper several days, my uncle decided to make a trip up the Kavala to visit some of our relatives who lived back in the forest. We hired a large canoe with boys to paddle it and started on the 50-mile journey. The whole country was one great forest. There were mahogany, ebony, lignum vitae, rosewood, ironwood, satinwood, cedar, rubber, and hundreds of other varieties of fine trees. The woods were full of game. At night we could hear leopards, and by day we often surprised a sort of pygmy hippopotamus wallowing in the mud at the edge of the river. The natives told us these were good to eat, so I determined to shoot one. I got my rifle out of the dunnage, loaded it, and laid it across my knees. We paddled for several hours without sighting a hippo. Then, on rounding a bend in the river, we came upon a big fellow, just about to enter the water. On seeing us, he made a low guttural noise in his throat and plunged into the bush. The river bank at this point was fairly high and steep, and it was necessary for the beast to proceed through the willow growth in a course parallel to the river. We could easily follow his clumsy movements. Finally he came to an opening in the brush, where he had either to show himself or double back on his tracks. He peered out at us through suspicious little bloodshot eyes. "Now," my uncle whispered. I took careful aim at his eye and pulled the trigger. He fell, and for a moment he threw himself this way and that, pawing up roots, breaking down little trees, and ripping up the moist earth. Then he lay still. We cooked several big slices of his meat. It tasted exactly like tender beef. As we saw more and more of this country, I was impressed with Africa's enormous resources. We had loaded our hold with priceless stuff all along its coast. Now traveling inland, I saw that not a thousandth of the treasure had been looted. I realized more than ever before its need for ships, and the fortunes awaiting those who could train and develop the Ethiopian race, to appreciate their wealth and intelligently exploit it. At last we sighted the clearing beside the river, where my relatives had their cottage and small farm. We went ashore, and after a short rest we were ready for whatever sport the country offered. Their hunting was done in lazy man fashion, which the hot climate made very agreeable. Each night after supper a lamb was tied to a stake in the yard in front of the house, where its pitiful bang could be heard by all the beasts of prey in the vicinity. We sat in comfortable chairs on the second-story porch and waited. As the evening grew darker, a hyena would sneak out of the brush and make for the lamb. A shot would ring out from one of our guns, and the hyena would be through lamb stealing forever. Some evenings it would be swamp leopards instead, which made a great deal better sport. These cats were big yellow fellows, with solid black spots, beautiful hides. We took many good leopard skins during our short visit, for which we were paid well in London some months later. They had little domesticated deer, called duikers, which were fine to eat and beautiful to see. They were mild little fellows. Their color was buff with darker spots, and they had little horns. Their proportions were perfect, and they would gambol over the lawn or stand and look at you out of large, doe-like eyes. When we were ready to leave, our relatives insisted on taking us up to Webo Falls. The country about the falls is like a great garden. The falls themselves are a series of small precipitous rapids, ending in a drop considerably higher than those above it. The natives had a way of testing a stranger's nerves. They would paddle as near as they dared to the falling water, and if the stranger remonstrated with them, they would laugh uproariously. Feller get scared damn easy. We had been warned beforehand, however, and we let the boys, who were paddling our canoe, take us so near that the water almost fell into the boat, narrowly escaping an upset rather than letting them have the satisfaction of seeing us frightened. When we returned to Harper, we found that the first mate had done some profitable trading in our absence. Our cargo was now a valuable one, and my uncle was anxious to reach Europe. After we made our departure from Harper, we dropped anchor but a few times. Sailing along the northwest coast of Africa, we ran into winds coming off the Sahara Desert, winds so dry they parched our lips and dried our skin. Hamatan winds, the sailors called them. We were thankful to pass through the Straits of Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean. We stopped at Qatta in Morocco, where we saw some of my father's people. All along the coast here at Tunis and at Tripoli, the water was crowded with small Arabian craft, with graceful lateen sails and rainbow colors. They looked more like a flight of seabirds than like ships. We dropped anchor at Alexandria and took several trips inland. We went up the Nile as far as Cairo. This was my first experience with the historic river. Later, I was to travel its whole length, and to sit at dawn at the outlet of Lake Nyanza, where the river springs, watching the clear water flow over the rock of Jinja in a miniature waterfall as it starts its long journey toward the Mediterranean. I was to see in later years unbelievable treasures along its bank, of which the world is still unaware. We stopped at several ports, each one more romantic than the last. At Genoa, we visited the home of Columbus. Here we attended an opera that lasted 3 days and 3 nights. There were 300 pieces in the orchestra and 1,500 voices in the chorus. There was hardly a bass voice among them. I remember the leader of the orchestra had long black hair. He grew so emotional over one passage in the music, and swung himself out so vigorously that he fell over backward. He never ceased waving the baton, however, and while he was on the floor, and during the moments he was rising to his feet, he continued to lead the orchestra through a difficult part of the music. I have a particularly good reason for remembering Naples. We were anchored in the bay for several days. Each evening we would go ashore to eat at one of the many little restaurants where one sits at tables on the sidewalk and eats spaghetti and sardines and drinks wine. On the evening before our departure, we came, as usual, to order our meal and to sit and watch these temperamental people and hear their rapid musical language. On this particular evening, however, something was wrong. The little groups at the tables were talking in hushed but excited tones. Our waiter was so preoccupied that my uncle had to repeat the order twice. People glanced nervously up the narrow cobblestoned street toward a corner half a block distant, where several streets converged. Suddenly, almost without warning, a mob poured around the corner from one of the side streets, surrounded an unpretentious stone building some 200 yards from where we were sitting, and commenced breaking in the doors and shattering the windows. Several shots were fired from within. Several of the men at the tables, leaping to their feet, reached for their weapons. The waiter dropped the wine and spaghetti. He was about to serve us, and drawing a wicked-looking stiletto from under his belt, dived headlong into the affray. Men gathered from everywhere to fight the assailants. Before we had a chance to move, the mob fight was underway, and had spread almost to where we were sitting. We were lucky to escape with our lives. My uncle fairly picked me off my feet as he dragged me out of danger. We could hear the high-pitched screams, and when we turned to look, 5 or 6 bodies lay bleeding on the cobblestones. By this time the soldiers had been aroused. They rushed past us down the narrow street, while the mob dispersed in all directions. That night, in my own safe bunk in the cabin, I dreamed fantastic nightmares of stilettos and soldiers and black-mustached Italians. At Marseille, my uncle and I left the ship to do the continent. It was April when we went ashore. All through the spring and summer and early fall, we traveled in France, Germany, Poland, and Russia. My uncle had made a good profit from the rugs and ivory and spices he had sold at Marseille, and our trip was in the way of a celebration. At some of the towns where we stopped, he did business for the ship, but in general we merely traveled, stopped at good hotels, enjoyed the plays we saw, the music we heard, and the fine weather. Meanwhile, Mr. Watson, the first mate, had sailed the ship around to Southampton. At the first sign of frost, we went to England, and aboard the Traveller. We sailed her up to London, and there the major trading of the trip occurred. The principles of trading, as I learned them then, and to a greater degree later in life, depend entirely upon supply and demand. One must know the best market for each part of his cargo. In some parts of Africa, a bolt of red cloth is worth a lot of ivory. The cloth is of use to the natives, the ivory is not. In England, the cloth is worth a few cents a yard, and the ivory thousands of dollars. The ship had left New York laden with a cargo of fairly inexpensive staples. By intelligent trading, our cargo became more and more valuable from port to port. By the time we arrived at London, we were loaded with spices, rare skins, herbs and dyes, ivory jewelry, priceless jade, ostrich feathers, and mohair, as well as less valuable cargo. We sold most of our jade and jewelry in London, as Americans in those days had no appreciation for antique Chinese ornaments. We took on a fine grade of English clothes, cashmere shawls, and prepared seal skins, and received a liberal balance in cash. The trading operations went on all winter, and we had time to visit many parts of the British Isles. When spring came, we made a record trip to Boston, encountering little bad weather with the exception of fog off Newfoundland. When we dropped anchor at Boston, cherry trees were in bloom, and there I left the crew of Traveller II. With the exception of my uncle, I was never to see them again. I said goodbye to the first mate, the boatswain Foley, old Johnson the steward, and to ever so many more of the men who had become my friends during our 3 years together. They all gave me presents to remember them by. The first mate kept blowing his nose and muttering something about the dod-blasted wind making his eyes water. Soon I was aboard a train bound for home. Thus, after a 3-year voyage, I returned to my parents in Philadelphia, having circumnavigated the globe by the age of 15.